Okay, welcome to the study group. Welcome, Chuck.
Thank you, Derek.
Welcome, everybody at home. I'm sure Mr. Kitty's around somewhere. Today, we're just going to do a quick little topical study. We just wanted to put together something about 20 minutes or less. And we're going to talk about purpose in life and finding life's purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be a struggle for everyone, but based on some of the studies that we've been doing lately, it's really about building that soul. Purpose in life is building that eternal vessel that we can have onto the next life.
True enough.
So I'm going to go to this title slide here, and maybe, Chuck, you want to talk about it?
Yeah. So here we have a really interesting story from the Jesus Papers in the Urantia book, where Jesus was up in the mountains one day and ran across this young man who was having trouble finding purpose in his life. He was discouraged, downcast, depressed, felt inferior, felt like nobody appreciated him. Plus, he also had problems growing up. His father died when he was young. So in some ways, he's very typical. Not that we all have exactly those problems, but we all have issues. Yeah. And we all have trouble sometimes finding, our path in life. So purpose finding is a real issue. Yeah. It's hard to have a satisfying life if you don't feel like your life has purpose. So we're going to look at this, but we're going to look at it from a spiritual perspective. I mean, there's the boots on the ground, nitty gritty issues around finding your day-to-day path, but having an overall kind of meta purpose really, really helps, because then you have a context and an inspiring sense of what your greater purpose in life is. So I thought I would just read the nugget of Jesus's instruction to this young man. I'm not going to read the whole section, but this little bit here, I think, will sort of launch us into this topic in an interesting way. Okay. So Jesus says to this young man, he tells him that you and your problems of living are real, right? Which is true for all of us. Our problems of living are real. You cannot escape them as long as you live. And then he says, set your mind at work to solve its problems. Teach your intellect to work for you. Refuse longer to be dominated by fear like an unthinking animal. So that was one of the problems with this young man. He was afraid. He was feeling a lot of fear, anxiety, uncertainty about life. So Jesus says that your mind should be your courageous ally in the solution of your life problems, rather than your being, as you have been, its abject fear slave and the bondservant of depression and defeat. So our minds can tell us all kinds of messages that keep us afraid. Right. And that's part of what he's telling him here. He says, make your mind be your ally. Don't let it,
Get your mind to work for you.
Get your mind to work for you. Exactly. Right. But then he goes on to say, but most valuable of all, your potential of real achievement is the spirit which lives within you, which will stimulate and inspire your mind to control itself and activate the body, if you will release it from the fetters of fear and thus enable your spiritual nature to begin your deliverance from the evils of inaction by the power presence of living faith. And then, forthwith, will this faith vanquish fear by the compelling presence of that new and all-dominating love of your fellows, which will so soon fill your soul to overflowing because of the consciousness which has been born in your heart that you are a child of God. So there's a lot of interesting things to look at in here, but one of them is the idea that love overcomes fear. So if you find God within yourself and you realize you're a child of God, then there's this overflowing of love that you feel from God, which then makes you want to go out and serve, your brothers and sisters. So you're no longer dominated by fear of failure. You're driven by anticipation of giving good gifts.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think also the spirit of truth comes and brings this level of generosity and love that is reflective of Jesus's nature. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it comes when you need comfort, and it's not always a joyous occasion, but there is a peace that comes with that love of mm-hmm. divinity that then we can share. And it's like setting an example for us, as Jesus always does.
Yeah.
Sets that demonstration, strikes that tone for us to follow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in my experience, it's usually of generosity.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right. So instead of being all just dwelling on ourselves, being all wrapped up in ourselves, we can look beyond ourselves.
Right.
And realize not only is there a whole world out there that we can serve in all kinds of useful ways, but there's also incoming spiritual ministry that will open our eyes, open the eyes of our minds to the reality of spirit, where we begin to see new values and new possibilities. And then we want to just get up and get going, and make things happen.
Well, that's where the creativity comes in, because it's one thing if you have a problem with an individual and you need to find a way to help serve them a little bit better or serve yourself in that relationship, but whatever's healthiest.
Yeah.
But then when there's new creativity, as we talked about in our last podcast, then there's this excitement of I can do stuff. And if maybe creativity is tied in with service, then that's like a real shot in the arm as far as your opportunities to take action on things, that engages your mind in a way that isn't based on fear. It's based on potentials that you want to actualize, that you're excited about fulfilling.
Right. You find a new reservoir of potential within yourself, that creative, the living water of spirit that is always flowing within us.
Right.
And last time we were talking about Urantia, which is the mixing of the spiritual with the physical, and our life purposes on this planet ideally have to do with that. So we're kind of taking the concept from the last podcast and bringing it into this arena of discovering purpose in life. And that should always have a spiritual part to it, even though we're walking the physical paths of an earthly existence.
That's right. Well, let's get into a quote.
Yeah.
And I'll read first.
Sure enough. Go for it.
Okay. So from paper 194, the coming of the Spirit of truth purifies the human heart and leads the recipient to formulate a life purpose single to the will of God and the welfare of men. I'm just going to read the other one right there too.
Okay.
Well, hold on. Let's talk about that first.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So the coming of the Spirit of truth, as I talked about in my sense, usually comes in generosity. And if you look at the nature of the Son reflecting the nature of the Father, it's usually in this loving way of doing the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people for the greatest amount of time. And so we get this opportunity now with the coming of the Spirit of truth to engage in that character, that nature.
Right. In a new way. I mean, the Spirit of truth is, in a very real sense, the presence of Jesus. So we can cultivate a companionship relationship with Jesus and have his influence like basically with us every day.
Yeah.
And he is obviously so inspiring in terms of this concept of service as doing good for others, that we can feel a new kind of, through the Spirit of truth, feel a new sense of excitement about actually being a co-worker with Jesus. Like we're working together on making things better on this planet, while at the same time we're growing our soul. So there's an inner development and then an outward service, sort of worship, service, that complement each other.
Now, also with this quote, to formulate a life purpose single to the will of God and the welfare of men. So let's talk about the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people for the greatest amount of time. But
that would be the will of God.
Right.
Kind of by definition.
Yeah.
Right.
And this is also tied up, as we were talking about, a little bit in purpose or in worship, because you get an opportunity to worship in God, to get this opportunity to get, let's say, insight and creativity to lovingly serve the many.
Right.
The whole.
Yeah, we can pick up on the nature of God through worship. Just by being with God, focusing our attention on God, we open our minds to that spirit presence within us that can create a new feeling. But, the feeling of being alive is transformed by an awareness of God's presence, because we're no longer just about ourselves bouncing off the insides of our skulls or our egos or our heads or whatever. We've got a bigger project going on, right? We want to work with God and think about what God's plans are, not just for us, but for this world and beyond. And that's when things really open up and become exciting, because it's a much, much bigger frame. So this we've talked about framing a lot. So this idea of finding a purpose in life is about, in many ways, it's about expanding your frame for what it even means to be a person on this
finding
planet.
A universal framework to work with.
Right. Yes. Uh-huh.
All right. Well, let me read the second one here. You must make a wholehearted choice of the divine will. You must obliterate the dead center of indecision. And I love that. It's like we were talking about this last night. Making this wholehearted choice to do God's will, it's a choice, but then there's an action that goes with that, like trying to pray to get insight and strength and wisdom to follow that will. But then obliterating the dead center of indecision in us as humans, how fickle we can be. And maybe this dead center of indecision, we're talking about how we might have this hammer that's going to obliterate, but we're just going to keep shanking off of it a little bit. Like, it's a process.
It is a process.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that, in a way, was the kind of the problem with this young man up in the hills. He was just like caught in this dead center of indecision. So all he did was wander around in the hills and avoid people, because he didn't have the confidence to go forward and actually do something in his life. He was just kind of stuck, you might say. So this thing about choosing the wholehearted choice of the divine will, what I find so fascinating about that is it's something we can choose even if we don't know what it is. Mm-hmm. In other words, at any moment, in any circumstance, I can choose to do the Father's will. I can choose to do the divine will, and then try to figure out what it is.
Yeah.
But that choice comes first. And that's what takes us off of this dead center of indecision. Because, okay, I'm making a decision.
Yeah, we made a choice. That's an action in itself.
It's an action in itself.
Yeah.
Right.
And just from my own experience, maybe I take that for granted, but I pray for, okay, what's your will? Like, grant me wisdom and spiritual guidance so I can figure this out. Right. What's going on here? What are you trying to do? And then what do you need from me? How can I contribute in this will?
Right. 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 So it's creative in that sense. And it's also, as you were saying, just making that choice is an action. And it's so interesting. The Father, God being parental in nature, doesn't give the game away.
I know.
He doesn't say, okay, take notes. I'm going to tell you what to do. Okay, go get in your car, drive over here, do this, do that. It's not like an app on your phone that tells you how to get from here to there. We still have to figure it out. That's what's so interesting. But the Father, as a parent, God knows the best path for each of us, but leaves it to us to kind of figure it out in his presence. Yeah. So we can get value reinforcement, especially if we're on the trying to make a difficult decision about something. It usually comes down to an evaluation of the options. Mm-hmm. So in that evaluation process, we're bringing value, not just do I do this or do I do that, but what choice is going to manifest the greatest value. Mm-hmm. So value comes from spirit. So we can definitely get help from the adjuster.
And value based on God's nature.
Right.
I know we're throwing a lot of things. We might be going pretty quick over here, trying to keep it under 20 minutes. But still, this notion of trying to pray for insight into what God's framework is and God's will, God's plan, so that you can be a part of it.
Right, exactly. And they say in other places that we have to have kind of exhausted our own potential for figuring it out. We have to have some options in front of us that we've worked on and we've figured out. Yeah. But then when it comes to the evaluation of those options, we can turn to the Spirit and get a higher value sense. And in my experience, usually when I do that, even a decision that seemed like really difficult, before I did that, all of a sudden it just becomes clear. I just like, oh, now I get it. Okay, I see. And that path is the right one, and it's clear. From a value perspective.
And I relate to that because in my experience, exhausting your own resources, like you have to act and keep acting and thinking and working and revising your plan and exhaust it all. Yeah. And then God will fill you with new.
Right.
But how can God fill you with new if you haven't used what he's already given you? You're all filled to the brim with spoiled stuff that you haven't used yet.
That's
why the act is ours. We have to use that stuff so that then we can be refilled with new.
Right. And part of that action is just talking things over with God, just talking things over, just like in a very personal and real way, like we would do with anyone. Just say, look, I've been thinking about this. I'm wondering if I should do this or I should do that. What do you think's the best path here? And just open our hearts to incoming guidance. Yeah. And it can happen. It can be very real.
Well, I was thinking about that today, actually, just kind of like, I remember hanging out with my grandfather before he passed away, and he had dementia. So it's not like we could talk to each other that much, but there was comfort in just sitting next to each other and being in the same room, that we would kind of feel each other's energy. And I feel that even that way, just sit there in the room with God if you can, just share space with God.
Just open up to that feeling of the divine nature. And we can have that both through the Spirit of truth and through the Father's indwelling presence. So we have both. And they'll kind of speak together to us, along with the angels and all the other spiritual ministries.
They got a lot of help.
They're all ganged up on us. So you want to go to the next slide?
Yeah, let's do this next one.
Okay. So here we have a couple of quotes that are kind of along the same lines, but with a little different twist to them. So on this first one, it says, this new gospel of the kingdom. So this is Jesus' gospel of the kingdom, which is essentially the message of sonship, the idea that we're children of God, that God is our divine parent, and we're children in this universal family. So this new gospel of the kingdom renders a great service to the art of living, in that it supplies a new and richer incentive for higher living. Meaning we now understand that our brothers and sisters in this life are also God's children, right? So that reframes everything, in a love context. And then it says, it presents a new and exalted goal of destiny, a supreme life purpose. So a supreme life purpose is a life purpose where spirit and matter are being blended, like we talked about with Urantia.
Like Jesus.
Right. And it has to do with self-mastery. It has to do with making values happen in the world and also within ourselves. So this gospel, the kingdom idea that, the people we associate with on a day-to-day basis are loved by God as much as we are. So by loving the people in our lives, we're essentially passing on the love of God and making it real through our actions.
Being a prism for God's love.
Right. And that's a supreme life purpose, to be able to do that is an example of that. And then in this last comment, they say, and fail not to remember that the will of God can be done in any earthly occupation. So kind of the message here, why I think that's an important statement, is that finding this higher purpose, this supreme life purpose, is not about, okay, do I take this job or I do that job? I mean, those decisions are important. We have to find our material pathway in this world, but the overarching purpose is spiritual. And that's what this is referring to. So in any job, you can be a loving person.
Yeah.
You can be a messenger of spirit, no matter where you are, what you're doing.
Well, it just reminds me of the inner temple is this bastion of spiritual relationship, that it doesn't matter what your environment presents. You can always go into the inner environment, the inner space that God dwells with you. It's kind of like this inside job, this private party. Everybody is looking to kind of like grasp to a best friend or have some kind of precious thing. But God already chose you to be his precious.
Right.
And so there's comfort in that, and I think that in this time of isolation, we have a tendency to maybe chase dopamine or emotions that maybe give us a thrill, but it's more of a material, visceral feeling. It's not quite of a higher value feeling. So maybe keep in mind for yourself, what am I gaining from seeking this? What am I seeking? What am I gaining from it? What is God gaining from it? Is my soul gaining from this? And is it going to go away after I experience it? Or is it going to build towards something eternal?
Right.
So I'm kind of looking at it as
Mm-hmm.
like in this whole building process is that you might want to look at yourself as, am I chasing dopamine, or I'm making up a new spirit amino acid or neurotransmitter now called buildamine.
Yeah, right.
And are you building
Build
the
the soul
kingdom? Build your soul, build the kingdom, because that lasts. That doesn't fizzle away.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the material pleasures have a place in life, but they tend to be done when they're done, right?
They have a shelf life.
They have a shelf life. They don't really add to a progressive development of self-mastery,
right?
Which is kind of what spiritual self-mastery is what we're really talking about here as a one way of talking about life purpose. And that can be done in many different ways. Each of us has our own path in terms of our skills and our abilities and how we can serve. And a big part of finding your purpose in life is understanding those dimensions of your own capacities and abilities. Yeah. But overarching that is this higher purpose.
To do God's will.
Which is to become more like God, to do God's will, to grow spiritually, develop our Urantia soul so we can get off the planet to the next life.
Well, getting to know God is going to build your soul. So it's all wrapped into doing God's will, like everything's wrapped into that. So just your real business in life.
That's it.
Is about doing God's will. And
you have to have a relationship with God to know what that is.
Yeah. Or at least ask him.
Yeah. We can't assume just based on promptings of conscience or anything else. Yeah. To know God's will, we have to know God. So that's what's exciting about that. That is how we come to know God. And that's how God has a relationship with us, is by our seeking that path with him, which is our highest path of highest potential, which is what he wants for us as a good parent.
Yeah.
Just like we would want
to spend time.
Yeah, exactly.
Just like my grandfather did. We didn't even have to talk. Just spend time.
Mm-hmm. Pick up on that feeling.
Yeah.
You get uplifted by the sense of companionship and love, and all those qualities that come into the worship experience will illuminate destiny. They say worship illuminates destiny. So,
well, amen. Well, thanks, Chuck.
Okay.
Having this quick little talk. Hopefully it serves you guys well, and maybe we'll do it again.
Yeah.
And God bless everyone. May you find your highest purpose in life, and may it serve you well.
May it be a thrill to fulfill.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, Chuck.
Sure. Thanks, Derek.
See you guys next time.
Yep. Thanks for joining us.